This lecture is a continuation of the lecture on seminars and teaching with discussion. Last time we considered the benefits of seminars as a medium for rigorous learning. I emphasised the need to press students for definitions, to compel them to join in, to keep them alert and a little bit on edge, and to think clearly about how the work they were reading had been composed in the first place. In this lecture, I want to address a few closely related issues. The first is the use of small groups and the way they help students in seminars to develop their ability to communicate not just on everyday matters, but intellectually. The second is the case method, which is a special type of seminar that's particularly useful in professional education. And the third topic is the role of humour in mitigating the rigour and exposure of seminar work. I brought this up briefly before in discussing the teacher-student relationship, and it's an important issue in thinking about classroom management. All these things help students to take ownership of the things they're learning. That is to say, moving from a general sense of what they mean to a very specific and precise knowledge that stays with them and guides them in their subsequent work in the discipline. Once the students really mastered some work, they start thinking along with the characteristics of the discipline. Now, small group work, which is a branch of seminar teaching, offers the students the chance to participate in more intense discussion groups than is possible when the full group is working. But of course, it's got to be closely monitored and worked on if it's going to remain relevant and effective. If you've got a group of, let's say, 15 students, break them into 5 groups of 3 and give each group a specific question based on the issue before the class. And also give them a time limit in which to discuss it. And while the groups have broken up in this way, obviously there'll be quite a lot more noise in the classroom, then it's appropriate for you as the teacher to move from group to group, listening in on how they're addressing the issue. While you're doing that, it's usually a good idea to keep your own comments to a minimum unless they appeal to you directly. Because obviously the point of this thing is to get them to think and to discuss with one another in their subgroups what's going on with the issue. And then after the designated time, maybe 5 minutes, ask a spokesperson for the group to report back to the class as a whole. That's an effective method. Or sometimes it's appropriate to ask each group a different question based on their reading, so that the reports will move you through the main issues of the class as the available time progresses. If you've got 4 or 5 main things you need to talk about, give one question to each group, and then structure the rest of the seminar around each group first introducing its answer on the basis of its own considerations. Here's an example. It's a freshman biology class at Duke University, and they're putting the small group concept into action. Professor Stephen Nowicki and his team teacher have already chosen a particular student to guide the activity as a way of emphasizing that the students need to take control. Now, this is a class on evolution, and they've begun by reading Charles Darwin's classic from 1859 on the origin of species by natural selection, the book that announced the general theory of evolution, and of course that remains controversial right up to the present. So let's see how the students respond to this assignment.
We're going to break you into groups, and we're going to give each group one topic. So you guys are going to be much more responsible for describing the one topic that's given to you. And since it's Darwin and it's kind of a harder text than the other one we read, we want you guys to look for specific examples in the reading which describe these ideas. We're going to give you the general ideas, and then you guys need to become more specific. And also, don't be afraid to question Darwin. I mean, it's possible that some of the things that he uses are wrong or questionable, so it's always good to question the text. So if there's something you think can be questioned, please bring it up, okay? We're going to give each of you one topic and just 5 minutes to discuss it amongst yourselves.
5
just
minutes.
one topic.
The 3 groups discuss sexual selection, the struggle for existence, and divergence of character. And these are 3 of the central issues in Darwin's theory. I particularly like the way in which the student introducer there said to them, even though this is one of the great monuments in the study of biology, still it's entirely appropriate for you to challenge the author himself. Just because he said it, don't regard that as sacred text which can't be challenged. He's encouraging them in a critical approach to the study right away, which is great. Now, when the 5 minutes are up, he then calls the groups to order, and each group in turn gives its own report. One group raises the question of whether humans are as susceptible to the principle of sexual selection as members of other species. And as you can see here, what happens is that the teachers themselves hang back as much as possible. They want the students to take complete control of the discussion. Although in the end, Professor Nowicki himself intervenes with a clarification to make sure the group keeps moving along profitable tracks.
So our group basically talked about if sexual selection is relevant within humans so much as it is in nature. And we drew some pretty interesting conclusions from that because we couldn't say a definite yes or no. To some degree, we believe subconsciously sexual selection does play a role in finding mates, even in human beings. But we'd like to think that since our intellect may be higher than those of animals in nature, we might be a little less shallow and look for personality rather than physical characteristics.
What were some examples from the text, from The Origin of the Species, that are weapons, means of defenses, or charms that was in the reading? This is open to all the groups. You guys want to just jump in?
Well, on page 56, he talks about lion manes and about alligators fighting over females, and it's sort of, and additionally, like plumage on birds, just general things that don't necessarily have a function, but I guess the function is to attract females and ultimately breed.
And they use sexual selection to like explain the existence of, like we were talking about on Tuesday, like the peacock tail or whatever. Like it would bring attention to you, so you'd be like attacked by enemies, and it just like takes more energy, like bigger investment of energy. So like with just normal natural selection, like you couldn't explain the existence of some of these traits, but then sexual selection would explain why that would exist, because natural selection, like it doesn't just, being fit doesn't just mean that you survive. It means you have to reproduce, which means you have to attract a mate.
So we're talking about species in nature. What, in general, what do you guys think about sexual selection in humans? Do you guys agree that people look for strictly speaking, physical characteristics? Do you guys think that plays a large part or a very minimal part?
Now or sometime in the past?
Now.
Well, I was going to say like 10,000 years ago versus 2,000 years ago.
How about with the
versus
planet within the
modern.
last 2,000 years?
I mean, even then, over that period of time, society has changed a lot. But I think it plays some role, but certainly, at least I'd like to think, not as much as in animals where they don't really have a personality to go by. I mean, humans tend to reproduce with people based, at least partially on personality, I would hope. So
That goes along with charms, doesn't it?
right, that's Darwin even mentioned the charms, you know.
Just as an aside, actually, there's now a growing field of biologists, behavioral ecologists interested in animal personality differences. Now, it's not the way we would describe. I mean, they're taking that term from the human usage, but there are. I mean, I've actually even published a paper or two about this. There are more or less aggressive songbirds, and it's a personality trait. But that's just an aside.
So I think it's somewhere in the middle, and I think as culture has advanced over the last 2,000 years, that we've certainly moved further away from sexual selection based purely on physical traits.
Well, now, just by exchanging and clarifying ideas like that, the students are teaching one another. It's sometimes a little bit slow and stumbling and sometimes awkward, and sometimes the students find it a little bit difficult to put into words what they're talking about, especially in questions like sexual selection. But that's what education is usually like. It's hardly ever smooth and easy. One hazard of this kind of student-centered learning is the possibility of the student's uncritical acceptance of a falsehood. And again, if you're the teacher presiding over a class of this type, you've got to be ready to intervene to make sure that the students don't go down a blind alley.
In the class I'm teaching right now, we constantly come up against points where the students are discussing an issue where I know if they had another bit of information, they would do better. And in those cases, I or my colleague might call a timeout. Some have argued that across cultures, men tend to want to marry younger women. They find younger women more attractive. Why would that be? Well, actually, life history theory makes it clear that the younger a woman is, the more reproductive potential she has. The older a woman is, the less chance she has to reproduce. Actually, here's some information, and that might be a 10-minute mini lecture. It might be a pop quiz, which is intended to get them to think about something, where the discussion of the answer is how we're getting the information. Or it might just be a simple statement of fact. You really need to know this one thing, and then we can go on.
The students themselves usually like classes of this kind, and they recognise that it stretches them and helps them to grow intellectually.
In one of the classes I'm taking about Darwin and DNA, the entire class will read a passage from the book that we're reading, and a student group will lead the discussion. They'll come up with some of the key ideas.
Being fit doesn't just mean that you survive, it means you have to reproduce, which means you have to attract a mate. It was a little difficult, to leading an entire class, but everyone seems willing to participate, so we just kind of had to get it rolling.
Would you call on people directly by name, or would you wait for them to join in?
In the beginning, we would call on them by name, and then it seemed like people got more and more into the discussion. They didn't want to wait to be called on.
And there's also the struggle within a given species.
We're really good at coming up with metaphors for the difficult concepts that are easy to relate to for the other students. Sometimes it's stuff from popular culture that a professor wouldn't necessarily have a grasp on.
The professors aren't saying, this is what's right. They're letting us form our own ideas, and if they're wrong, they'll correct us. But if not, we can have the satisfaction of knowing that we came to that conclusion on our own.
Another hazard of small group work like this is the passenger phenomenon. By that, what I mean is the tendency of some students to let others in the group do the work. Obviously, even in a group of 3 or 4 students, you'll have some dominant personalities and some rather passive ones. And your job as the teacher is to make sure that the passive ones are joining in one way or another. If, for example, you know that one student is reluctant to speak up, that's the person whom you should designate as that particular group's representative. Or after the students have done the presentations, call on those who haven't yet contributed to make sure that they've got something to say as well. Partly to give them the confidence to join in, which is one of the things we should be doing, and partly also to make sure that they're not simply coasting along on the basis of other people's work. Now, another possibility with small groups is for role-playing. And as a history teacher, this is something I quite often do. If I feel that the students are getting into this sense of fatalism, which I've mentioned several times, the idea that, of course, history happened the way it did, and that when they start forgetting that things could have turned out in a very different way, I often break the group up into small subsections and assign each of them an identity and tell them to prepare a little bit of role-playing on those lines. For example, if we're discussing America in the 1850s, I'll say, all right, this group has got to role-play a slave. This group represents a slave master. This group represents an abolitionist. This group is an Irish immigrant, and that group is a Yankee patrician. Now, we've been reading about different points of view in the America of the 1850s. So this is an opportunity to ask members of each group to prepare a statement on the characteristics of his or her life in America in 1855, and then to speak with as much conviction as they can muster from that particular person's point of view. And very often what happens at first is that the spokespeople they don't really get into it very well, and so they say, he would say that he didn't like being a slave. Some sort of weak, detached thing like that. But gradually, as they start filling the shoes of the person in question, they become more engaged. It's entertaining as well as informative. And it's useful too, it's educational, because it compels the students to get into an unfamiliar frame of mind and to realise that other people in other times and places really did believe things that they themselves find abhorrent. This is one of the great challenges of teaching history and all the social sciences. People with different ideas really did believe in their ideas, just as we believe in our ideas. Otherwise they're always going to be falling back into the habit of assuming that our current moral judgments applied back then. Small group work and role-playing also offers very valuable opportunities for public speaking and for making impromptu arguments. In other words, the representative of the group has actually got to say, I believe in human equality because, or else they've got to say, it would be wrong to free the slaves because. Incidentally, that's a particularly difficult one because obviously the horror that everyone feels now about the fact of American slavery makes it particularly difficult and particularly worthwhile to get back into the frame of mind of somebody who believes that slavery was right. They need to understand that there were such people and that they did have cogent arguments to make, even though they're arguments we no longer accept. And then you'll have the kid who's a drama major who loves it and says, My life in America is still hard, but it's not as hard as it was in Ireland because, and they'll fake the Irish accent and tell us how much better it is to be living in America in the 1850s. Now, another useful small group activity, which I sometimes do, is to post questions, just have some questions and write them out and post them in different parts of the room and then give each group the chance to visit the questions one by one. Actually, to migrate around the room, looking at the questions and coming up with answers to them. Make that the basis of the discussion, which will then take the rest of the seminar class. And this, again, is one of those areas where it's possible to coax a little bit more participation from shyer group members than they'd feel ready to give when the whole group was assembled. Obviously, students' anxieties are a real problem, and you may think it's paradoxical that on the one hand I'm trying to induce anxiety, and at the other time trying to alleviate it. But it's all in the service of helping them to become more educated and helping them to come out of themselves, to participate more effectively and to learn more effectively. Now, moving on to a second issue now, the case method. The case method is a special type of seminar in which a group of law students or business or medical students study a case beforehand and then come to class ready to answer their teacher's searching questions about it. It offers a kind of dry run for the sort of work they're going to be doing when they're professionals. And this is the method used primarily by Michael Roberto, the business professor at Bryant University. When we visited him, he was teaching his senior seminar at Bryant, where the seniors brought together skills and ideas that they'd learned in many of their different classes and then applied them to particular examples. In this instance, they're studying the Walt Disney Corporation under the leadership of Michael Eisner in the 1980s and 90s. And before the class began, the students had read extensively and they'd been given study questions to prepare so that they could talk effectively about it. Now watch the way in which Dr. Roberto calls on individual students and then coaxes them to consider some of the issues that have been raised in the reading. And incidentally, this is a class which makes you realize that people like Mickey Mouse can be very, very serious matters when you think about it in terms of business.
Why are the characters such a highly valuable resource that leads to such powerful competitive advantage? Megan?
Well, they're unique. No one else really has them.
They're unique.
And then also they kind of span across generations. Like Disney's not making a ton of new animated movies. They just keep re-releasing movies from before the 80s even. So it's kind of like they keep giving.
Every 7 years is another generation getting introduced to Cinderella, right? So they're timeless and unique. What else? Matt?
They're also protected by intellectual property, so no one else can copy them. So pretty much you have this whole IP portfolio of all these characters that no one else can copy. You're just finding out different ways to distribute them to a consumer. I mean, that is in a sense competitive advantage, since no one else can copy it.
Right? IP protection makes them inimitable. Right? Or, more simply said, can't copy it, right? So if you have a unique, inimitable asset that's timeless, that doesn't depreciate in value, wow, that's very powerful. Any other pieces to this?
They also make a lot of sequels too, so they're constantly like putting a fresh spin on these similar characters and just...
Which helps keep them timeless, right? And the last piece here, right, is that the profit or value is completely appropriable by Disney. What does that mean? Appropriable. Well, if Tom Cruise is making movies for you, and he is a great character that you make sequels with, who gets all the value? Tom Cruise. But as Warren Buffett said, the best part of Disney is the mouse has no agent. Right? Disney gets all the profits.
Now, as you can see in that little example, Dr. Roberto elicits remarks and fills in the gaps, such as that beautiful insight that Mickey Mouse never makes outrageous new contract demands. You probably noticed also that sometimes he'd call on people by name if he thought they weren't joining in, and at other times would just react to a student who was raising a hand. But there's a great feeling of inclusiveness in that class. A few minutes later, in the same course, he called on a student by name to consider whether Disney would benefit from branching out into hotel ownership and toy manufacturing. In other words, is it appropriate for Disney to keep everything in-house, or should they diversify? Other students join in. Now, these are very, very well-prepared students. They're the best students at the college. And they can see the pros and cons in each case, so the professor doesn't need to say all that much as they swap ideas. They're bringing together insights from many of their more specialized business classes, and they're synthesizing a variety of work they've done as they think about the actual problems confronting a corporation when it works to maintain a strong market position.
How about the cost of writing a contract, Justin, to let Marriott operate a Disney-branded hotel in Orlando, Florida?
Very difficult, because they
Why?
want their brand image there at the forefront, and they want a long-term contract. You have to renegotiate all the time, and they have their own brand equity too to fight for.
Okay. Other comments on that, Matt?
The other thing too is Marriott or another established hotel chain would be in a much better bargaining position for some type of contract than a random manufacturing firm in China, just because they have that kind of presence, and they're really, in terms of large chains, there's like a handful. When you look at everything under Choice Hotels, you got that one group, and then like a couple other chains as well. So they have, it's like if you don't go to them, there's not really that much else to turn to. Whereas there's a ton of factories in China that have open space to manufacture stuff.
Rex?
Back to Justin's point too, Disney can still control what products reach the customer, even if the Chinese manufacturing company is making them. Whereas the hotel, if they try to step in and control how Marriott is presented to the customers, that's almost micromanaging, and they'd probably get upset with Disney.
Chris?
Disney itself creating a hotel can be any type of hotel it wants. If it creates a Marriott hotel or a hotel similar, it has to kind of fit the mold of what Marriott already is, meaning it has to be a 3 or 4 star hotel as opposed to it can be a cheaper budget hotel if it wanted to under a Disney label. It can be whatever it wants. It doesn't have to fit any mold.
Has more control.
Exactly.
Kate?
Well, yeah, off that point, I think Marriott has its own brand name that it wants to promote. Like if it was really successful doing these hotels, Marriott would want to say that we were together with Disney factories producing the toys, have no interest in designing new toys or new characters.
Exactly. Margaret, can you write a contract to say how Goofy's going to behave at the character breakfast with my daughters?
No, there's a lot of uncontrollable things with hotels, whereas producing consumer products is pretty much set.
You can send a blueprint over to China, say this is what Mickey looks like, the shirt has to have that image on it, and you can inspect that, and you're done. How do you inspect whether every day in multiple hotels in Orlando, every character is interacting in a positive way?
There's a lot of variables that can't be written into that contract.
You got it. And thus it's very costly to contract, so we move it in-house. Paul?
Well, Disney originally realized this when he opened the first theme park. They had all the concessions licensed out and the product stuff licensed out, and they bought it back eventually so they could have complete control over how it operated. So I see the same thing here.
Absolutely.
When I went to Disney when I was younger, I went to the character breakfast, and I got hit with Goofy threw a strawberry at me, and I cried the rest of the breakfast, and I had all
You're still scarred by it today!
It was a Pocahontas shirt, and I loved it, and I remember he threw it, and I cried, and Chip and Dale came over and were like trying to comfort me.
Well, the episode suddenly takes a comical turn there when the student describes Goofy throwing the strawberry. But the student's remark also perfectly underlines the point that the teacher's been getting at. In other words, that it's very difficult to control many individuals' conduct. So unexpectedly, it was the perfect illustration. You probably noticed a little bit earlier in that clip that Professor Roberto was writing key points on the board as well when he came up with the idea of the inappropriable nature of Mickey Mouse. So many things are coming together here, his effective use of an old traditional technology. Now, the kinds of questions raised in this case method seminar are exactly the kinds of issues these students are going to have to deal with when they in turn become working business managers. So clearly here, this is professional education of the best kind. They're going to be faced sooner or later with the question of how appropriate it is to expand or to maintain things within their own corporation. But did you notice that the whole thing only worked effectively because the students were so well prepared? If they hadn't done the work, if they hadn't been reading up on the case beforehand, no amount of prompting by the professor was going to make very much difference or have any effect. And the students are well prepared, partly because of a creative system of incentives that many faculty members now use, including Professors Nowicki and Roberto, who we've been watching in this lecture. Among the incentives are the idea that the students themselves should evaluate one another. They should also give their ideas about how effectively the various students have joined in. Now, discussion classes of the kind we've been discussing in the last lecture and in this one especially when they're combined with reading, with lectures, and when appropriate with laboratory work. All these things help the students take ownership of the disciplines. And obviously that's what we're aiming for as teachers, to get the students really thinking along with the discipline. Every discipline's got its own characteristic way of approaching problems. But as I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, they're rarely intuitive. For example, with the scientific method, it's important to understand the importance of the control group, and it's important to understand that a theory is only really a scientific theory if it's falsifiable. In other words, if you can subject it to experiments which may confirm it but may falsify it. If it actually includes the possibility of explaining away its own falsification, it isn't really a scientific theory. And that's something that students have got to learn because it's counterintuitive. Now, think also about many of the disciplines students study at the college level: anthropology, sociology, psychology. It's very unusual for students to study those at the high school level, and therefore they're encountering them for the first time in school. And that means that they're encountering unfamiliar methods. Discussion classes can be very, very useful in getting them to think along with the discipline. It's particularly important for teachers to remember that the familiarity with the discipline that they feel after years of experience is not something that the students share. And this is an idea they particularly need to have closely in mind when they're in introductory courses. Students really begin to own the discipline when they can outline accurately how they should approach a problem analytically. They should look at a series of issues and say, now here's how, as sociologists, we ought to do it. Or here's how, as psychologists, we should respond. When they can foresee what the obvious fallacies are going to be, when they can anticipate the obvious experimental missteps and the interpretive blind alleys. And I can't emphasize too strongly that this is a long, slow process in most cases. It's often deferred until the very last years of college or sometimes into graduate school. But of course, it's very, very gratifying to you as a teacher when it really does begin to happen. And even more gratifying to you as a student when you suddenly realize, I've learned how to do it. I've learned how to think like a biologist or like a historian. In every walk of life, it's the prelude to professionalization, the habitual adoption of the discipline's or the profession's point of view in a way that would never occur to a layman. Finally, I'd like to just say another word about good humour. Good humour is an essential aid to learning these things, particularly in seminar settings where the students feel a great sense of exposure and where many of their teachers are actually intensifying that exposure by compelling them to join in. You've seen many places in these excerpts where the group starts to laugh or where the teacher grins and gives up on the point. It's an important element of successful seminar work to show them that although it's serious and although it's difficult, it isn't ultimately serious, and moments of humour can certainly relieve the severity of classes that they sometimes otherwise feel. Scott Page, in his class on complexity at the University of Michigan, makes a joke at his own expense in this clip to relieve the tension that's come with work on a very difficult mathematical issue.
Actually, the first time the people in this market ever met, they had me in to talk to all of them, like 500 people that play in this market. And they gave the top 50 performers copies of this book I wrote, and the rest of the people got T-shirts. And I had to sit there and watch the people trade my book for T-shirts. It was an awful experience. Okay, so why? Right? Why is this the case? So one of the things we want to do.
In the same way, in my own seminar, a serious moment breaks down into laughter when the student who can't think of the answer gets a theatrical whisper from her neighbour, and I'm happy to let it go at that point. Why does population rise?
Oh, that's the question.
That's the question.
Okay,
that's the whole question.
Why does population rise?
Yeah. There are two possibilities.
Immigration or...
Actually, there's three possibilities. Immigration is one. What are the other two?
Higher birth rate.
Higher birth rate.
And... Somebody help me out here. Immigration. Higher birth rates, what? Oh, lower death rate.
Did somebody whisper lower death rate?
Lower death rate. Oh, yeah, people are living longer.
Exactly. Yeah. Seminars are extremely useful for close analysis of texts, for getting students to think systematically about argumentation, about vocabulary, about rhetoric and style, no matter what the subject matter. And participation in seminars, even if it's coerced at first, helps students to refine their public speaking skills, helps them improve their precision with the language and their ability to persuade one another. But it's only effective if the participants are adequately prepared. So you need as a teacher to create incentives, to reward intelligent participation generously, and to stimulate an attitude of engagement in the seminar atmosphere. Don't let students simply say what they feel. Whenever a student says to me, says in seminar, I feel this, I say, I'm not really interested in what you feel. I'm interested in what you think, and your thoughts have got to be related to what you just read. Insist that they say what they think and why they and how they can justify those thoughts on the basis of their studies. Talking intelligently about any topic is a key step on the road to taking ownership of the material and of developing a professional kind of effectiveness. So, as a seminar leader, you need to be demanding, but you always need to leaven your rigor with at least a little bit of humour. In the next lecture, I'm going to introduce the question of teaching students ways of improving their writing.